with a sip from her ever-present coffee cup, brought all the way from Earth in a vacuum-sealed thermos. She took in the welcome party. Rows of Cypherian guards stood stiff and motionless in jet-black armor, a poor man's attempt at intimidation. Their helmets were smooth, featureless, save for glowing red visors that pulsed in perfect synchronization. In front of them, standing on a levitating platform shaped like an oversized throne, was Grand Vizier Bolvir, the Emperor's chief advisor and master of ceremony. He exuded an air of smug superiority, the kind that came naturally to those who had never been punched in the face. Jessica adjusted her aviators and strolled down the ramp, as if she were stepping into a backyard barbecue rather than an interstellar court. The vizier's elongated face twisted in disapproval. "You are late," Bolvir declared, voice carrying an unnatural reverb, as if he were speaking from several dimensions at once. "Yeah, my bad," Jessica said, not looking the least bit sorry. She took another sip of coffee. "Your landing instructions were vague, and I had to circle the system 3 times to find a decent parking spot. Almost ran out of gas." The vizier's lips curled, his elongated fingers twitching. "The Empire does not tolerate inefficiency." "Neither does my boss," she replied. "And yet here we are." A murmur rippled through the assembly. Cypherians were not accustomed to irreverence. Jessica, however, had built a career out of it. She was, after all, America's most unorthodox diplomat. Earth didn't send her because she played nice. They sent her because she got results, and because most of the traditional ambassadors were too fragile for assignments where assassination was a distinct possibility. The vizier gestured sharply, and a pair of attendants approached, carrying a tray with a silver goblet. "As is custom, our honored guests partake in the elixir of greeting," he announced. Jessica eyed the drink. She had been briefed on Cypherian hospitality, which was a fancy way of saying they liked to test their guests. No doubt the liquid inside was laced with some mind-numbing chemical designed to make negotiations easier for them. She considered playing along, but where was the fun in that? Instead, she reached into her jacket pocket and produced a small, single-serve creamer cup. Popping the lid with one hand, she poured it directly into the goblet, stirred it with her finger, and took a sip. Not bad. Could use more sugar, though. Silence. Absolute, stunned silence. A Cypherian dignitary sputtered. You have tainted the sacred elixir." Jessica smacked her lips. "Nah, I improved it. Besides, if your drinks can't handle a little dairy, that's a you problem." The vizier's eyes narrowed. This was not going as planned. "Very well," he said, clearly deciding she was beneath further ceremony. "We shall proceed to the Imperial Palace." He turned sharply, leading the procession toward a hovering transport. Jessica followed, hands in her jacket pockets, the very image of casual indifference. Inside the transport, everything was sleek, sterile, and cold, like the waiting room of a high-end laser surgery clinic. Bolvir sat across from her, flanked by 2 guards. "We have been monitoring your species," he said, voice silky with menace. "Your rapid technological progress is concerning." "Uh-huh," Jessica replied, feigning disinterest. She tapped at the side of her coffee cup. "You guys have Wi-Fi here, or am I going to have to hotspot off my phone?" The vizier ignored her. "Your people are unpredictable, unruly, dangerous." Jessica grinned. "That's the nicest thing anyone's ever said about us." Bolvir's fingers curled against the armrest. "The Emperor believes your kind must be studied closely." Jessica's smile didn't waver. She had met dozens of men like Bolvir. They all thought they were the smartest person in the room. They all mistook confidence for arrogance. And they all had the same problem. They didn't know when to shut up. The transport landed with a barely perceptible hum, and the doors hissed open to reveal the Imperial Palace. The architecture was grand, certainly, but sterile in its perfection. Jessica had seen Earth casinos with more personality. A retinue of armored guards led her inside, through corridors lined with towering golden statues of Cypherian rulers past. She resisted the urge to critique the decor. The banquet hall was a vast chamber of polished obsidian, illuminated by floating orbs of soft blue light. A long table stretched through the center, adorned with exotic alien delicacies, none of which looked particularly appetizing. Seated at the far end was the emperor himself, a towering figure draped in layers of shimmering silk. His face was hidden behind an elaborate mask of interlocking plates, his eyes the only visible feature, burning pinpricks of orange light. Jessica strolled up to the table, pulled out a chair, and plopped down with all the grace of someone who had just finished a long shift at a dive bar. The emperor tilted his head slightly. "You are different from what we expected," he said, his voice deep and measured. "I get that a lot," she replied, reaching for what looked like a bread roll. It squirmed in her hand. She put it back. Bolvir took his place beside the emperor. "We welcome you, Ambassador Victor. May this feast mark the beginning of a prosperous future." Jessica's eyes flicked across the table. She could practically feel the tension in the air. Cypherians weren't just bad liars, they were lazy liars. The way they watched her every movement, the subtle, anticipatory stillness. They were waiting for something. She picked up the goblet in front of her and gave it a sniff. It smelled like overripe fruit mixed with something acrid. Poison. A poor choice, really. She had spent years building up an immunity to all sorts of toxins, an occupational hazard of Black Ops training. Still, she couldn't resist the opportunity. Locking eyes with the emperor, she raised the goblet and downed the entire thing in one go. Then, for dramatic effect, she licked her lips and let out a satisfied ah. "Not bad," she mused. "Tastes like gas station wine." The room went utterly silent. Bolvir's face betrayed the first flicker of something resembling unease. "You." Jessica set the goblet down and reached for another roll, giving it a tentative poke. This one didn't move, so she took a bite. "Oh, is this supposed to be poisoned?" she asked through a mouthful of alien bread. The emperor's glowing eyes flared. The guards moved as one, reaching for their weapons, but Jessica was already in motion. She flicked the goblet across the table, hitting one guard square in the face. Before the others could react, she was on her feet, flipping the table with a single powerful kick, sending dishes and poisoned delicacies flying. The nearest guard lunged at her, only to meet the business end of a chair leg to the throat. Chaos erupted. The dignitaries scrambled away from the melee. Guards rushed forward, weapons drawn, but Jessica was already moving, a whirlwind of precise, brutal efficiency. She grabbed a decorative serving platter and sent it spinning like a discus, knocking one attacker unconscious. Another rushed her with a plasma dagger. She sidestepped, grabbed his wrist, and used his momentum to flip him onto the table, shattering plates beneath him. The emperor rose, his voice a furious roar. "Enough." Jessica paused, straightening her jacket. She adjusted her aviators. "You try to kill me," she said, casually kicking a groaning guard aside. Bolvir stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You should be dead." Jessica smirked. "Buddy, I eat spicier food than that for breakfast." The emperor stared at her for a long moment. Then, with a gesture, he motioned for the remaining guards to stand down. Jessica took another bite of bread. "So," she said, chewing thoughtfully, "are we signing this trade deal, or am I going to have to start breaking furniture?" She had expected an assassination attempt. What she hadn't expected was how bad they were at it. The poison had barely tingled, the guards had moved like they were underwater, and the entire thing had been so laughably obvious she was almost offended. If this was the Galactic Empire's idea of a deadly trap, they were in for a rude awakening. The software of surveillance drones overhead reminded her she was being watched and probably recorded. Good. Let them watch. Ahead, two guards in obsidian black armor blocked her path, gripping energy batons. Their glowing visors gave them an insectoid appearance, a design choice that probably worked on most species. Unfortunately for them, she wasn't most species. Jessica didn't break stride. The guards hesitated a fraction too long, uncertain if they should move in or wait for a command. She made the decision for them. With a sharp pivot, she snapped out a kick that connected with the side of the nearest guard's knee. There was a sharp pop, a strangled yelp, and he crumpled instantly. The second guard had just enough time to swing before Jessica caught his wrist, twisting it at an unnatural angle. The baton clattered to the floor. Before he could react, she drove an elbow into his faceplate, shattering the visor with a satisfying crack. He slumped against the wall, unconscious. Jessica rolled her shoulders, adjusting her jacket. Her coffee cup, miraculously, was still in her hand. She took a sip and kept walking. The Imperial security network was either incompetent or wildly overconfident because she wasn't met with a full squadron of reinforcements. That meant they were regrouping, likely planning a more coordinated strike. Smart, but not smart enough. She moved quickly, navigating the unfamiliar palace with an ease that would have unsettled the Cypherians if they had any idea how she operated. Jessica had always possessed an almost preternatural ability to assess and exploit environments. She saw the weak points, the patterns of movement, the little inefficiencies that others ignored. And right now, she was seeing just how unprepared the Empire was for her. She reached her guest quarters, the lavish suite the Empire had assigned her, and stepped inside. The moment the doors hissed shut behind her, she activated the security panel on the wall, bypassing its primitive encryption in seconds. The palace's internal sensors flickered and died, replacing the real-time feed with a loop of her standing by the window, gazing out at the skyline. Basic misdirection, but it would buy her time. She set her coffee down on the nightstand, cracked her neck, and exhaled. And then, finally, she let the mask slip. Jessica Victor was a diplomat, yes. She was also something much more terrifying. Once, a long time ago, she had been known by a different name, whispered in the darkest corners of the galaxy. The Baba Yaga, the Boogie Woman, the ghost that entire fleets had failed to kill. The truth was, Earth had never been weak. They had simply let the galaxy believe that. And Jessica? She was one of the reasons that lie had held. A soft click from the vent above her bed alerted her to movement. They were already here. Quick, quiet, almost impressive. Almost. Jessica didn't move, didn't react, even as the first assassin slithered down from the ceiling, landing soundlessly behind her. A second emerged from the shadows near the door, gliding forward with inhuman grace. Two more crept in through hidden panels in the walls, weapons gleaming under the soft artificial light. 4 of them, maybe more outside, waiting. They had learned something from their earlier failure. Not enough, but something. The first assassin struck, a curved blade whispering toward her throat. Jessica moved at the last possible second, her body a blur as she twisted aside. The blade cut through empty air. Before the assassin could recover, she seized his wrist, pivoted, and drove his own knife into his side. No sound, just a sharp inhale, and then he was gone, crumpling to the floor. The second assassin was already lunging. Jessica intercepted his strike with a flick of her wrist, deflecting the blow before driving her knee into his stomach. He staggered, and she finished him with a precise, brutal strike to the throat. The last 2 hesitated. Mistake. Jessica grabbed the edge of the bed and flipped it, sending it hurtling across the room like a battering ram. It crashed into the third assassin, pinning him against the wall. Before the final one could react, she closed the distance, grabbing him by the front of his uniform and slamming him headfirst into the reinforced glass of the window. The impact shattered the surface, spiderweb cracks spreading outward in jagged lines. The assassin slumped. Jessica let him drop. Silence. She exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders. The entire fight had lasted less than 10 seconds. From the hallway, she could hear the hurried footsteps of reinforcements. The Empire was finally realizing the magnitude of their mistake. She considered her options. Escape was easy, too easy. But she wasn't here just to survive. She was here to send a message. She reached for the control panel by the door and accessed the palace's mainframe. Security systems, communications, surveillance, all of it now in her hands. She smiled to herself, fingers flying over the interface. In the depths of the palace, alarms began blaring. Doors locked and unlocked at random. Lights flickered, bathing entire sections in eerie, pulsing darkness. The Imperial Guard's command center flooded with conflicting reports. Jessica Victor spotted in a dozen different locations at once. And then, just for fun, she activated the palace intercom. A single song echoed through every corridor, every chamber, every high-security war room. Danger Zone by Kenny Loggins. Chaos erupted. Jessica grabbed her coffee, took one last sip, and stepped into the hall, where a squad of wide-eyed guards had just arrived, weapons raised. She could see the fear behind their visors, could feel it in the way their hands trembled. She smiled. "Hi, boys," she said. "Did you miss me?" The first guard panicked and fired. Jessica sidestepped the blast, grabbed his weapon midair, and swung the butt of a rifle into his chest, sending him sprawling. Before the others could react, she was in their ranks, a whirlwind of calculated violence. A rifle cracked against the floor. A helmet crumpled under her fist. One guard tried to run, and she swept his legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground with a strangled yelp. The last one, barely more than a kid, dropped his weapon and threw his hands up. Jessica tilted her head. Smart. She picked up one of their comm units and held it up to her mouth. "Hey, Bouvier," she said, knowing he was listening. "You might want to call off the next wave. Your guys are looking a little fragile." Silence. Then, the vizier's voice laced with carefully measured rage. "You think this is a game?" Jessica shrugged, even though he couldn't see it. "I think I just ruined your whole night. So yeah, I'm having fun." The line cut off. She grinned. They would escalate now. They had no choice. The Emperor would demand a response. And when they sent their best, when they finally stopped underestimating her, she would show them why, across 1,000 worlds, people still whispered the name Baba Yaga with fear. She adjusted her jacket, stepped over the groaning bodies of the guards, and walked deeper into the palace, humming along to Danger Zone as it echoed through the halls. This was about to get interesting. The palace was burning. Not in the literal fire and smoke sense, though that could happen soon, but in the way an empire buckled when it realized it had miscalculated in the most catastrophic way possible. Panic echoed through the hallways, the once pristine corridors now filled with the frantic shouting of officers and the erratic movements of soldiers who had been trained for everything except this. Jessica Victor walked calmly through the chaos, her boots clicking against the polished floor as alarms blared from the walls. She had not planned for things to spiral this quickly, but she had also never expected the Cypherians to be this bad at handling one woman with a grudge and a high tolerance for caffeine. They had underestimated her. That was their first mistake. Their second mistake was assuming they were still in control. She could hear them now, scrambling. Orders barked over comm channels, security lockdown protocols being overridden only to be scrambled again moments later. The palace's AI was fighting a losing battle against the virus she had planted in the system, rerouting power, scrambling targeting systems, ensuring that every automated turret now viewed Imperial forces as hostile targets. It was almost unfair. Almost. A pair of officers sprinted past, their weapons drawn, too focused on their own survival to notice her. She let them go. Not because they weren't a threat, nothing in this place was a threat to her anymore, but because she had bigger problems. The Empire was reacting. Finally, the first real wave of opposition arrived moments later. A squad of heavily armed soldiers in full combat gear, their energy rifles glowing with a dull crimson charge. They moved with precision, far more coordinated than the panicked palace guards she had dispatched earlier. These were the elite, the Emperor's personal death squad, trained for suppressing rebellions, assassinating planetary leaders, and crushing uprisings before they began. Unfortunately for them, Jessica was an uprising of one. She ducked as the first volley of plasma fire scorched through the space she had just occupied, flipping behind an overturned table. Her hands moved before she thought, scooping up a discarded sidearm from one of the unconscious guards littering the hallway. The weapon was alien, sleek, heavier than she preferred, but functional. She fired a single shot and watched with satisfaction as the energy bolt struck the nearest soldier square in the chest, sending him sprawling. The others adjusted, moving in formation, cutting off her escape routes, pressing forward with relentless, tactical efficiency. Cute. She let them think they had her pinned, Let them advance just enough to commit fully to the engagement. And then she moved. Vaulting over the table, she closed the distance before they could react, her first strike knocking the rifle from the nearest soldier's hands. She spun, using his own momentum against him, flipping him into his nearest ally. The remaining two hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough. She grabbed the fallen rifle and fired a shot into the lighting system above, plunging the corridor into flickering darkness. She moved through the shadows like a specter, disarming, dismantling, destroying. A rifle, butt to the temple, a boot to the kneecap, a stolen blade driven into the gap between armor plates. When the emergency lights flickered back to life, the squad was down, and she was already moving again. Somewhere deep within the palace, she knew Bolvir was watching, seething. The vizier had orchestrated this entire affair, underestimated her, planned her demise, set these events into motion. She imagined him standing before a massive holographic display, watching his elite warriors crumple like paper dolls. The thought brought a smirk to her lips. Her earpiece crackled, a familiar voice cutting through the static. "Jess, tell me you're still breathing." She tapped the comm on her wrist. "I'm offended you even had to ask." The voice on the other end sighed in relief. "We're seeing the whole thing from orbit. You have got to tell me how you got Danger Zone onto their emergency broadcast system." She grinned. "Trade secret. Listen, we just intercepted an urgent transmission from the Emperor himself. They're pulling back their ground forces. You scared them so bad they're opting for total orbital lockdown instead." Jessica's smirk faded slightly. That wasn't great. Orbital lockdown meant the Empire was ready to play its final card, planetary bombardment. If they couldn't kill her on the ground, they would erase the palace, and her with it. It was the kind of tactic reserved for full-scale planetary rebellions, the kind that left worlds smoldering ruins. That they were considering it now, for one person, meant they understood, finally, just how badly they had messed up. She needed an exit strategy. Fast. The palace's hangar was her best bet. If she could get to a ship before the fleet above fully mobilized, she had a shot. A slim one, but better than none. She turned a corner and nearly ran into another squad of soldiers, these ones armored differently, insignias marking them as something even higher in the chain of command. Special operatives. Assassins. They didn't hesitate. The first lashed out with a blade longer than her forearm, the curved edge flashing under the emergency lights. Jessica twisted, narrowly avoiding the strike, countering with a sharp elbow to the attacker's ribs. The second came at her from the left, fast, too fast, his movements almost inhumanly precise. She barely managed to sidestep, catching his wrist, and using his own momentum to send him crashing into his ally. No wasted movements. No hesitation. These were the real deal. Good. The fight became a blur of movement and instinct. She struck with precision, countered with efficiency, let their own aggression work against them. One attacker faltered. Another staggered back, gripping his throat where she had landed a perfectly aimed strike. They were skilled, but they weren't her. The last one standing realized it too late. His blade wavered for half a second. Jessica capitalized on it, driving forward, disarming him with a practiced twist of her wrist and sending him to the floor with a brutal kick to the sternum. Silence. She exhaled, rolling her shoulders, scanning the corridor. The hangar was close now, just beyond the next security checkpoint. Her earpiece crackled again. "Jessica, I hate to rush your whole unstoppable force thing, but the fleet just locked onto your position. You've got maybe 3 minutes before they vaporize that entire section of the palace." She swore under her breath. No time for subtlety. Jessica sprinted forward, her boots barely making a sound against the floor. The final checkpoint stood ahead, 2 massive blast doors, locked down, guarded by a last desperate defense force. They were waiting for her, weapons raised, their stances betraying the fear they barely kept in check. She didn't slow down. The first shot fired, but she was already in motion. The second was closer, grazing past her shoulder, the heat of it searing through her jacket. She hit the first guard like a wrecking ball, driving him into his companion before either could react. Her elbow connected with a jaw, a knee with a stomach. She wrenched a rifle free, pivoted, fired a single shot into the control panel. The blast doors groaned, then slid open. She bolted through, breath coming fast, eyes locking onto the nearest ship, a Cypherian interceptor, sleek, built for speed. Perfect. The hangar shook violently as the first orbital strike hit the far end of the palace. She felt the shockwave before she heard it, the deep, thunderous impact of energy cannons carving into stone and metal. The fleet wasn't waiting anymore. She didn't bother with pre-flight checks. The cockpit sealed around her, controls lighting up in alien script. She ignored protocol, bypassed safety systems, and slammed the ignition. Engines roared to life. As she shot out of the hangar, the comm channel crackled again. "Jessica, you are not going to believe what just happened." She leveled out, dodging a barrage of panicked Cypherian fire. "I swear, if you say they just put out an intergalactic bounty on me, I'm gonna—" "Oh, they did. But that's not even the best part." She gritted her teeth. "What's the best part?" "They're calling you the Baba Yaga of Earth." Jessica let out a slow, satisfied breath. "Finally," she muttered. She hit the thrusters and disappeared into the stars. The interceptor cut through the void, its engines burning hot as Jessica wove through the remnants of the Imperial blockade. Explosions flared in the distance, stray debris spinning in the vacuum, the aftermath of a fleet scrambling to contain the kind of problem they had never accounted for. They had tried to kill her, twice, and now they were learning the hard way that some mistakes couldn't be undone. She gripped the controls, muscles taut, eyes scanning the chaos ahead. The Empire had always operated under the assumption that power was something absolute, something held in massive fleets and bureaucratic strangleholds. They had never learned what happened when they backed the wrong person into a corner. The comm crackled again, and she flipped it on without taking her eyes off the readouts. "Jess, I don't know what you did, but the Emperor is in full meltdown mode. There are reports coming in that half his advisors are either fleeing or suddenly unavailable for comment." She smirked, adjusting course. "What can I say? I have a way with people. You also have a fleet trying to kill you." Jessica exhaled slowly, flexing her fingers. "They're not my problem anymore." She tapped a sequence into the ship's controls, locking onto a trajectory that led directly back to Cypherian Prime. "You're going back?" The disbelief in the voice on the other end of the comm was almost comical. "Damn right I am," she muttered. "I've got unfinished business." The Cypherian capital came back into view, its spires cutting against the swirling backdrop of hyperspace distortion. They hadn't expected her to return. They probably thought she'd cut and run, disappear into the void like any other fugitive. But Jessica Victor wasn't just any fugitive. The landing bay was swarming with activity. Squads of Imperial guards rushed to position, scrambling into defensive formations. Rifles trained on the lone interceptor as it touched down with a controlled hiss of depressurization. Jessica stepped out before the engines had fully cooled, adjusting her jacket, the sheer audacity of her return forcing a moment of hesitation from the assembled forces. A single figure emerged from the throng, Grand Vizier Bolvir, his normally immaculate robes slightly disheveled, his expression twisted into something between fury and disbelief. He took a measured step forward, as though trying to comprehend the very concept of her still being alive, let alone standing before him again. "You," he hissed. "You dare." "I dare," Jessica interrupted, her tone light, almost conversational. She took another step forward, and the guards collectively tightened their grips on their weapons. "And if anyone here so much as breathes in my direction without permission, they'll be figuring out how to walk again in about 6 months." Bolvir's lip curled, but he did not order them to fire. Not yet. He wasn't an idiot. He had seen what she had done, had watched his forces crumble under her hands, and now the weight of all his failures sat squarely on his shoulders. Jessica let the silence stretch, let the tension coil tighter. And then she smiled, slow and dangerous. "Take me to the Emperor." It was the last thing he wanted to do, but he had no choice. The walk through the palace was different this time. Gone was the arrogance, the smug superiority that had coated every inch of her arrival. The palace staff avoided looking at her, the guard standing just a little too stiffly, as though unsure if their weapons would even help them if she decided to start something. By the time she was led into the emperor's private chamber, the weight of her presence had already begun to sink into the very foundations of the palace. The emperor stood before a massive projection of the imperial fleet's status reports, his posture rigid, his hands clasped behind his back. He turned only when the doors sealed shut behind them, his glowing eyes studying her with an intensity that might have once been intimidating. Jessica didn't wait for him to speak. She strode forward, casual as ever, and plucked an exotic fruit from a nearby display of refreshments. She took a slow bite, chewed, and gave a thoughtful nod. "Not bad," she mused. "Bit tart." The emperor's silence stretched. "You should have left when you had the chance," he said finally. Jessica wiped her hand on her jacket. "You should have done your homework before trying to kill me." His eyes narrowed, a ripple of something like frustration passing through his otherwise unreadable expression. "You think you have won something here?" "I think," Jessica said, taking another step forward, "that I'm still standing, and your empire just had a very public, very embarrassing lesson in why it shouldn't start fights it can't finish." Bolvir, standing stiffly at the edge of the room, barely contained his outrage. "You are a nuisance, a single human against an empire. You think your actions will change anything? You are insignificant." Jessica's smirk didn't waver. She turned her attention back to the emperor. "See, that's your problem. You keep looking at me and thinking I'm alone." She tapped her wrist calm, activating the secure frequency that had been waiting for her signal. The emperor's display flickered, then changed. Live footage flooded the massive screen, feed after feed of star systems, planets, fleets, entire sectors of space. And in every single one, a message was repeating, the same message broadcast across the empire. Earth wasn't weak. Earth wasn't helpless. Earth had been watching. The emperor's expression didn't shift, but the tension in the room changed, shifting from arrogance to something far more uncertain. Jessica leaned in slightly, her voice dropping just enough to force his full attention. "You sent assassins after a diplomat," she said. "You violated intergalactic law. And now, every single government in the known galaxy is watching you scramble to clean up the mess." She let that sink in. "See, the thing about Earth? We're a little unpredictable. We're not the strongest, we're not the oldest, but we do have a nasty habit of not staying in our lane. And now, because of you, the entire galaxy is very interested in what happens next." The emperor remained silent, but Bolvir was practically vibrating with fury. "This is an act of war." Jessica clicked her tongue. "This is an act of public relations disaster. And it ends one of two ways. One, you keep pretending you have the upper hand, you keep escalating, and this little mess of yours turns into a full-blown nightmare." She took a step closer, voice dropping to a near whisper. "Or two, you do the smart thing. You sign the treaty. You recognize Earth as an equal, and you walk away with your empire intact." Bolvir scoffed. "You think we would ever bow, to?" The emperor raised a single hand. Bolvir fell silent. The emperor studied Jessica for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he turned to the display and tapped a single command. A new message flickered onto the screen. "Trade agreement ratified. Diplomatic recognition of Earth approved." Jessica exhaled, her smirk widening. "See," she said, "that wasn't so hard." The emperor turned back to her. "You understand that this does not make you untouchable." Jessica laughed, low and amused. "Buddy, if there's one thing you've learned today, it's that I was never touchable to begin with." She turned on her heel and strode toward the exit. The doors slid open, and as she stepped into the corridor, she heard Bolvir's barely contained rage burst out in frantic whispers behind her. She didn't care. She had won, and as she walked out of the imperial palace for the last time, the whispers of Baba Yaga followed her into the stars.